Close your eyes and journey with me to the far north, where fjords carve deep into stone, where the sea whispers to the shore, and where longhouses glow with firelight against the winter dark. You may have heard of Vikings as raiders and warriors, but beyond the clash of steel lies another world, a quieter world of family, of farming, of myths, of laughter, of feasts of faith. Tonight, we step into that world, not as warriors, but as travelers of memory. We will walk the shores of Scandinavia, sit by the hearths of longhouses, hear the songs of skalds, and follow the seasons of the north. This is not the story of raids. This is the story of life. Close your eyes and imagine the northern world. The land of the Vikings begins where the sea carves deep into stone. Towering fjords rise like silent guardians, their peaks capped with snow that never melts. At dawn, the mist drifts low across pine forests, and the sound of gulls echoes above waters where long, narrow boats glide like shadows. This is not only a land of warriors. It is a land of families, of farms, of lives woven into the rhythm of the seasons. Life in Scandinavia was shaped by the land itself. The soil was rocky, and the winters were harsh, but the people were resilient. Their longhouses stood sturdy against the wind, timber frames packed with clay and turf, warm with the heat of fire. Within those walls, the story of Viking life began, not in conquest, but in survival, in the stillness of early morning. Smoke curled upward from the hearths of villages. Children helped gather water from streams that cut through the mossy hillsides, while women tended goats and sheep in small enclosures near the houses. Men repaired fishing nets or sharpened tools, preparing for a day on the water or in the fields. The sea was more than a path to distant lands. It was a lifeline. Fish dried on wooden racks, cod and herring salted for the long winters. Farmers scratched furrows into the earth with simple plows pulled by oxen, planting barley, rye, and oats. It was hard work, but the land gave what it could, and in return, families endured. To be Viking was not only to raid or sail. It was to build, to mend, to carve out a place against the vast silence of nature. The land itself spoke to them. The forests whispered with spirits. The mountains seemed alive with ancient power, and the stars wheeled above like the eyes of the gods. At night, families gathered around the hearth, the firelight flickering on carved wooden beams. Elders told stories of how the world was made from the body of a giant, how Odin gave his wisdom, how Thor defended the realms from chaos. In these stories, children found comfort and adults found meaning. They reminded each soul that they were part of something greater, an endless cycle of birth, life, and death. Beyond the raids, beyond the battles, this was the true heart of Viking life, the quiet connection between people, land, and myth. Step through the heavy wooden doors of a Viking longhouse, and you leave behind the biting wind of the northern coast. The air inside is warm, thick with the smell of smoke and stew. A fire burns along a stone-lined hearth that stretches the length of the hall, its glow flickering against carved beams. Here, family life unfolded, a world quieter than raids and battles, but no less vital. Families were large, for kinship was the strongest shield against hardship. Grandparents, parents, children, even thralls, the enslaved workers, lived under the same roof. Every member had a role, every hand a purpose. The eldest women often oversaw the home, keeping order with a firm word and sharp eye. For in Viking culture, women commanded respect. Morning began with chores divided by age and strength. Children rose early, their breath visible in the cool air of dawn, and carried buckets to collect water. The women ground grain into flour on heavy stone querns. their rhythmic turning echoing softly through the hall. Men prepared for fishing, mending nets, shaping wooden traps, or setting out to hunt in the forests. But life was not only labor, it was learning. Around the hearth, boys listened to their fathers speak of honor and courage, while girls watched their mothers craft cloth from wool, spinning threads that would one day be traded for silver. Every action was a lesson, every story a thread binding one generation to the next. The longhouse was more than shelter. It was a world in itself. Its central hearth provided heat, light, and the sacred flame believed to carry blessings from the gods. Along the walls, raised platforms served as beds by night and benches by day. Woolen blankets kept out the cold, while carved chests held precious tools, jewelry, and heirlooms passed down through time. At night, the family gathered. A father might recite sagas of ancient heroes, his voice carrying the weight of tradition. A mother told tales of the gods, weaving myth with everyday wisdom. Children listened wide-eyed, the glow of firelight dancing on their faces. In these quiet moments, values were shaped. Loyalty, courage, hospitality, and reverence for the unseen. Outside, storms raged and winter winds screamed against the wooden walls, but inside the hearth circle, warmth endured. The family was a fortress against the world. Here bonds were forged not in steel, but in love, duty, and survival. For every raid that history remembers, there were countless nights like this, of laughter, of shared meals, of quiet prayers whispered to Odin, Freya, or Thor. These were the roots of Viking strength, unseen by enemies, yet more enduring than the clang of swords. The longhouse was the cradle of culture, and in its glow, the Viking spirit found its deepest meaning. Beyond the longhouse, the land stretched wide and untamed. Fields lay between forests and sea, carved from earth that was stubborn, rocky, and often unyielding. Yet this was the lifeblood of Viking families. Farming was not just survival, it was identity. Every furrow dug into the soil was a pledge, a struggle against nature, and a prayer for mercy. Barley and rye were the most faithful crops, able to endure short summers and thin soil. Oats and flax followed, offering both food and fibers for cloth. Each season brought its rhythm. The spring plowing, the sowing, the anxious watching of skies, the summer harvest, and a long winter when stores determined who lived and who starved. Picture a Viking farmer guiding his oxen as a wooden plow groaned through the earth. The air smelled of damp soil and salt carried in from the fjords. Children scattered seeds in his wake, their small hands careful, their eyes wide with the hope of bounty. In the distance, women carried water in wooden buckets, while others milked goats, their laughter mingling with the bleating of animals. Animals were as vital as crops. Cattle gave milk and meat, sheep provided wool, and pigs offered fat that sustained bodies through endless winters. Even chickens scratched in the dirt near the longhouse, their eggs treasured as small gifts of life. Farming was communal. Every task, from mending fences to gathering hay, required many hands. But the North was merciless. Summers were short, and winters stretched long into the bones. Too much rain ruined fields. Too little brought hunger. Frost could fall before the harvest, killing grain in a single night. And when the stores dwindled before spring, meals grew sparse. Thin soups of barley and bitter herbs replaced feasts, and hunger haunted the hall like a silent guest. Yet even in scarcity, there was resilience. Families shared with neighbors, for kinship meant survival. To give food when little remained was not weakness, it was honor. A man who fed others was remembered long after his death. for generosity was strength in the north. The cycle of farming was bound to the gods. Before planting, families offered sacrifices, bowls of milk poured on the soil, bread crumbled into furrows, or even the blood of an animal spilled as an offering to Freyr, the god of fertility. They whispered to the earth itself, asking it to awaken. Harvests were celebrated with song and fire, gratitude woven into every loaf of bread baked from the first grain. To the Vikings, farming was never just toil. It was sacred work. Every seed held promise, every sprout a gift, every harvest proof that the gods had not turned away. The rhythm of field and season was as holy as any raid spoils, as meaningful as any battle won. When winter finally came, the fields lay bare, the earth locked in ice. Families gathered indoors, living off stores of dried fish, salted meat, and casks of ale brewed in autumn. By firelight, tools were repaired, nets mended, and clothing spun from wool. Outside, the world slept under snow, but inside, stories and songs kept spirits alive. The farmer's life was never glorious, yet it was the heart of Norse endurance. Without the plow, there was no voyage. Without grain, there was no warrior. Behind every axe and every raid stood the quiet strength of those who wrestled food from the frozen ground. Beyond the sagas of conquest, it was farming that allowed the Viking world to endure. As the fire crackled in the longhouse, the world outside seemed far away. But within those flames lived stories older than memory. The Vikings saw their lives not as separate from the gods, but as threads in a vast tapestry woven by unseen hands. The sagas told that all creation began with ice and fire, when the frozen void of Niflheim met the searing sparks of Muspelheim, and from their clash came Ymir, the great giant, and the first of life. From Ymir's body, the gods shaped the world. His flesh became earth, his bones the mountains, his blood the seas. Above it all stretched the great ash tree, Yggdrasil, its branches spanning 9 worlds, its roots twisting into darkness. To live was to walk beneath its shadow. Every Viking child grew up hearing these tales, learning that they too were part of the great cycle that bound gods, men, and giants together. Each god held power over daily life. Odin, the one-eyed wanderer, was lord of wisdom and fate, but he was feared as much as loved, for his gifts always carried a price. Thor, red-bearded and mighty, defended mankind from the forces of chaos, his hammer Mjolnir cracking the sky with thunder. Freya, radiant and mysterious, guided love and fertility, while Freyr, her brother, blessed the fields with bounty. These were not distant deities, but companions in daily struggle. A farmer plowing his field might whisper a prayer to Freyr for rain. A sailor setting out across dark waters carved Thor's hammer into the wood of his boat for protection. Even simple acts, lighting a fire, cutting a tree, burying the dead, were bound to ritual. The gods walked with them, invisible but never absent. But belief was not only worship, it was woven with magic. Seer, the art of weaving fate, was practiced by women known as Volvas, seeresses who walked between worlds. Draped in cloaks, carrying staffs carved with runes, they chanted and sang, calling on hidden powers. Kings and warriors sought them out before great journeys, asking what the Norns, those who spun destiny, had woven for their lives. Runes themselves carried magic. Carved into wood, stone, or bone, each symbol held meaning: protection, victory, love, or vengeance. A warrior might etch them into his blade, believing it carried power. A mother might scratch them into a child's cradle for safety. To the Norse mind, every word, every symbol, carried weight in the unseen world. Superstition lingered in every shadow. The howl of wolves on a winter's night was not only the voice of beasts, but a reminder of Fenrir, the monstrous wolf fated to devour the sun at the world's end. Strange lights in the northern sky, the aurora, were thought to be the reflections of Valkyrie's armor as they rode to claim the fallen. Dreams were never dismissed as idle wanderings, but taken as messages, signs whispered by the gods, or warnings of what lay ahead. In these beliefs, the harshness of life found meaning. Storms were not accidents, but the wrath of Thor. Illness was not chance, but the touch of unseen spirits. And every act of kindness or cruelty echoed in the halls of the gods, to be remembered when a soul's fate was judged. Yet at the heart of all Norse belief lay a certainty. The end was coming. Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, was inevitable. One day, fire and ice would clash again. Giants would march against the gods, and even Odin and Thor would fall. But from destruction would rise renewal, a new world reborn from the ashes. This belief shaped Viking courage. Death was not feared, but embraced as part of the cycle. To live with honor, to die with courage, was to take one's place in the greater story. Around the hearth, as snow pressed against the longhouse walls, these tales filled the air. They were not only myths. They were mirrors of life itself, guiding each man, woman, and child through the quiet battles of survival. Though tales of the Vikings often speak of swords and shields, their true strength lay in their hands. The crafts that shaped wood, iron, and cloth into tools of survival and beauty. Step into a small workshop near the fjord. The smell of smoke and hot metal fills the air. A blacksmith leans over his anvil, hammer striking rhythmically, sparks dancing in the dim light. Each blow shapes more than iron. It shapes destiny. Axes, nails, rivets, farming tools, all were born here. Without these, there could be no ships, no homes, no life. Blacksmiths held quiet power in their villages. Their work carried a hint of magic. Iron itself was thought to have protective strength, warding off spirits. To wield a well-forged blade was not just to carry steel, but to hold a piece of sacred craft that connected man to both gods and earth. If the blacksmith was the heart of strength, the shipbuilder was the soul of freedom. Along the shores, wooden frames rose like the skeletons of great beasts. Longships, with their sleek, curved hulls, were crafted not with haste, but with generations of knowledge. Each plank was split, bent, and fastened with iron rivets, sealed with tar from pine trees, until the vessel was strong yet light enough to glide across both rivers and seas. The longship was more than a tool of war. It was a bridge between worlds. It carried farmers to markets, families to new lands, and traders to distant shores. To the Vikings, the sea was not a barrier but a road, and their ships were the finest in the world. Even enemies marveled at how they cut through water, swift as shadows, graceful as birds in flight. Trade flowed along these waters like blood through veins. Viking merchants traveled as far east as Byzantium and the Abbasid Caliphate, and as far west as Ireland and beyond. They carried furs, walrus ivory, amber from the Baltic, iron tools, and honey. In return, they brought back silks, spices, silver coins, and even glassware from the distant south. Picture a bustling market at Hedeby or Burka, stalls crowded with goods, the air filled with the murmur of many tongues: Norse, Frankish, Slavic, Arabic. Merchants weighed silver coins on scales. Children clutched carved toys. Women fingered foreign fabrics. This was not a world of isolation, but of connection. Viking hands touched goods that had traveled halfway across the earth. craftsmanship extended into daily life as well. Women spun wool into yarn, dyed with colors from plants, deep blues from woad, reds from madder root, golden yellows from birch leaves. Looms filled the longhouse, where cloth was woven into sturdy sails or fine garments trimmed with furs. Jewelry, too, was crafted with care. Brooches of bronze, necklaces of glass beads, silver arm rings etched with intricate knots. Each piece of craft carried meaning. A brooch was not only decoration, but a mark of status. A carved comb might be gifted as a token of affection. Even simple household objects, spoons, bowls, chests, were adorned with patterns of dragons and interwoven lines. To the Norse, beauty was not luxury, but part of life itself, woven into every tool and garment. But trade was not without danger. Merchants faced storms at sea, bandits on river routes, and the constant threat of betrayal. Yet they pressed on, for silver and honor alike lay beyond the horizon. Wealth was more than comfort. It was prestige. Silver arm rings became symbols of power, used to reward loyalty or seal oaths. A man who could spread wealth gained followers, for generosity was the currency of respect. Through trade, Vikings were not only raiders, but participants in the grand web of medieval commerce. They brought the North into contact with far-off empires, blending cultures in ways unseen but lasting. A piece of silk in a Norse burial, a dirham coin from Arabia found in a Swedish field. These are the echoes of journeys that stretched across continents. In the quiet of evening, when the forges cooled and sails were folded, one could see how deeply these crafts and trades shaped Norse identity. A warrior might boast of victories, but his life depended on the smith who forged his blade, the shipwright who built his vessel, the farmer who grew his food, and the merchant who brought him treasures. Behind every saga of blood and glory was this quieter saga of work, skill, and exchange. This, too, was the Viking legacy. Not only the terror of raids, but the wonder of craftsmanship, the reach of trade, and the quiet genius of people who shaped their world with fire, wood, and will. In the glow of the hearth, where stories were told and meals were shared, love quietly took root. Viking society was built not only on strength, but on bonds of kinship, weaving together families into a web of loyalty and obligation. Marriage was at the heart of this web. It was rarely a matter of fleeting passion. It was a joining of families, a pact that carried honor, land, and legacy. Young men and women did not always choose freely. Families met to negotiate unions, deciding what dowries, lands, or livestock would seal the bond. Yet affection was not absent. Many sagas speak of couples who grew to love deeply after marriage. Their partnership forged in shared work, hardship, and laughter around the hearth. A wedding was more than ceremony. It was a sacred rite. The bride's family prepared a dowry, chests filled with clothing, tools, and precious objects. The groom's family offered gifts in return, often silver arm rings or land. On the day itself, feasting and drinking marked the union, with witnesses gathered to honor the oath. At the center of the ritual stood Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, symbol of protection and fertility. Some traditions placed it in the bride's lap, blessing her womb for future children. As the couple clasped hands, they were bound not only in flesh but in fate, their lives entwined like the knots carved into their jewelry and wood. Inside the longhouse, marriage meant partnership. Husbands were expected to provide through farming, hunting, or trading, while wives managed the household. Yet Viking women were far from silent. They controlled the keys to the storerooms, oversaw servants and thralls, and made decisions about food, cloth, and trade. To hold the keys was to hold authority, and sagas speak of women who wielded that power wisely and fiercely. A good marriage was built on respect. A man who mistreated his wife dishonored himself, and a woman could seek divorce if betrayed. She could reclaim her dowry and leave with dignity, a freedom rare in much of medieval Europe. Kinship, after all, was too important to shatter with cruelty. Love, however, was not confined to arranged unions. The sagas tell of passion that defied tradition, warriors smitten by women of far lands, or maidens who chose lovers against their family's will. Skalds, the poets, sang verses of longing, weaving words into gifts more precious than silver. A well-crafted poem could win a heart, its rhythm echoing like the waves against the shore. And love could be bittersweet. A warrior's farewell to his wife before a raid, a mother's kiss on her child's brow before he grew into manhood, a widow's quiet mourning by the sea. These moments gave depth to the Viking soul. For even amidst steel and storms, tenderness endured. Children were treasures, but also responsibilities. Each birth was celebrated, yet survival was never certain. Infants were sprinkled with water in a naming ceremony, receiving not only a name, but the blessing of the family gods. Names carried power, often chosen to honor ancestors, binding the child to the strength of kin who came before. Kinship reached far beyond the immediate family. Cousins, uncles, grandparents all formed the threads of support. If a man was wronged, his kin defended him. If he prospered, they shared in his wealth. To be without kin was to be vulnerable. And so every marriage, every child, every bond reinforced the strength of the clan. Tea feasts, kinship shone brightest. Long tables groaned with roasted meats, bread, and ale, while songs and stories filled the air. Brothers clasped arms, sisters laughed, and elders raised cups to the honor of their lineage. A toast was not just celebration, but a vow, a reminder that blood and memory bound them tighter than iron. Kinship also extended through fosterage, where children were sometimes raised by allies or distant relatives, weaving bonds between families. Such ties could be as strong as blood, forging alliances that outlasted quarrels and carried peace across generations. In the end, love and kinship gave meaning to the Viking world. Raids brought wealth, farms brought survival, but family brought purpose. To leave behind a strong line of sons and daughters, to uphold the honor of kin, was the truest measure of a life well lived. And so, in the quiet moments after feasting, as fires dimmed and the hall fell silent, families lay close beneath woolen blankets. Mothers whispered prayers over their children. Fathers stared into the embers, thinking of ancestors and unborn generations. Beyond the storms, beyond the raids, it was love, quiet, steady, enduring, that shaped the soul of the North. When the harvest was gathered, the ships returned, and the hearths filled with warmth, the Vikings turned to celebration. Feasts were the beating heart of their community, moments when toil and hardship gave way to laughter, song, and fellowship. Picture a great longhouse on a winter's night. Torches line the walls, shadows dance across carved beams, and the air swells with the smell of roasted meats and fresh bread. The hum of voices grows until the chieftain raises his cup, and silence falls in reverence for the first toast. Feasting was more than pleasure. It was ritual. The first cup of mead was lifted to the gods, poured in honor of Odin for wisdom, Njord for prosperity, and Freyr for the fertility of the fields. Only then did the revelry begin, flowing like ale into wooden horns. Food was plentiful on these nights, a reward for months of labor. Whole boars roasted slowly over the fire, their skin crackling as the fat sizzled into flames. Platters of fish, loaves of barley bread, and bowls of butter and cheese filled the tables. Ale brewed from barley and mead made of honey flowed endlessly, warming bodies against the winter chill. These meals were not only nourishment, but symbols of wealth and generosity. A host who provided a grand feast gained honor. A stingy one invited shame. Hospitality was sacred, for to welcome and feed guests was to show strength, abundance, and trust in the favor of the gods. But food was only the beginning. Skalds, the poets and storytellers, rose to their feet, reciting sagas of gods and heroes. Their voices rose and fell like waves, carrying listeners into distant battles or the halls of Valhalla itself. Each word was poetry, each line a thread binding past to present. Music filled the spaces between stories. Flutes carved from bone, harps strung with horsehair, and drums beaten with steady rhythm carried the hall into a realm beyond labor and survival. Men and women clapped hands, stomped feet, and sometimes broke into song themselves, their voices weaving into the roar of the hall. Games and contests were woven into the feasts. Men tested strength in wrestling, women matched wit in riddles, and children played with carved wooden toys at their parents' feet. In the corner, a game of Nefatiful, a strategy board game, might stretch late into the night, warriors moving their pieces as though commanding armies. Drinking contests were common, too. Horn after horn of mead passed around, each man daring the next to match his thirst. Yet even in merriment, the rules of honor remained. A drunken insult could spark bloodshed, and so chieftains and elders kept watch, ensuring laughter never turned to chaos. Festivals rose above even the greatest feast days, marking the sacred turning points of the year. The most important was Joel, the midwinter celebration that later echoed in Christmas traditions. Fires blazed against the darkness. Animals were sacrificed in thanks to the gods, and toasts were made for peace, fertility, and good fortune in the year ahead. Another great gathering came at the start of summer, when warriors prepared for voyages and raids. Offerings were made to Odin and Thor, seeking victory and safe return. In autumn, harvest festivals honored the bounty of the earth and the promise of survival through the long, cold months. These festivals were not only about the living. They bridged the worlds of the seen and unseen. Ancestors were remembered in solemn moments, their names spoken aloud so they would never fade. Libations were poured onto the earth, inviting the spirits of kin to join the feast. In these rituals, the living found comfort, knowing they were never truly alone. The air shimmered with a sense of the sacred. Every song, every sacrifice, every toast carried meaning. Joy was not separate from faith, but a way of honoring the gods, showing gratitude, and weaving strength into the fabric of community. As the night deepened, torches flickered low, and the last songs faded into silence. Guests lay on benches wrapped in woolen cloaks, the scent of smoke and ale heavy in the air. Outside, the wind howled across the fjords, but inside, warmth endured. Feasts and festivals gave the Vikings more than food and drink. They gave them memory, connection, and hope. In the laughter of kin, in the voices of poets, in the music of harps, the Norse spirit found renewal. Tomorrow would bring labor again, storms and hunger again. But tonight the hall was alive with joy. Beyond raids, beyond hardship, this was the heart of the Viking soul. The ability to celebrate, to honor, and to find light in the long dark. For the Vikings, life was a journey, but death was not an end. It was a crossing into another realm, a path laid out long before birth. To live with courage was to meet death with honor, for fate could not be avoided. it could only be embraced. The Norns, three mysterious weavers, sat at the roots of Yggdrasil, spinning the threads of every life. No man, no god, could escape what they wove. This certainty gave the Norse their fearless spirit, for to fear death was to resist what was already chosen. The most honored afterlife was Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain. There, Odin himself welcomed warriors who died bravely in battle. Vast as the sky, its roof was said to be made of shields, its rafters of spears. Day after day, its warriors fought mighty battles against each other, only to rise again, wounds healed, to feast at night on endless boar and mead served by Valkyries. For many, this vision was not terror but hope, a chance to live forever in glory, preparing for Ragnarok alongside the gods. Yet Valhalla was not the only fate. Those who died at sea were believed to join Ran, the sea goddess, in her cold hall beneath the waves. Farmers and common folk often turned to Folkvanger, the meadow ruled by the goddess Freya, where half the chosen dead were said to dwell in peace. Others went to Hell, not a place of torment, but a realm of quiet shadows, ruled by the goddess Hel, daughter of Loki. There, the dead lingered in stillness, neither punished nor glorified, but remembered through the love of their kin. Burial was a sacred act, binding the living to the dead. Some were laid in earthen mounds, with grave goods to ease their passage, weapons, tools, jewelry, and food for the journey. Others were set upon ships, the vessel becoming both coffin and chariot to the other world. In rare cases, ships were burned in fire, flames consuming the body and smoke carrying the soul skyward. Each rite echoed the belief that death was not loss, but transformation. Kinship did not end with death. Ancestors were honored at feasts, their names spoken aloud to keep memory alive. Spirits were thought to linger near their homes, watching over descendants, guiding dreams, or warning of danger. Some longhouses even buried their dead beneath the floor, so that generations lived quite literally above their kin, walking daily over the bones of memory. The bond between past and present was unbroken, woven like a thread through every life. Fate, however, was never gentle. Death came by sword, by sea, by sickness, by winter's hunger. And yet, the Norse met it not with despair, but with dignity. A man's worth was measured not by how long he lived, but how he faced the end. Cowardice brought shame that lasted beyond the grave. Courage brought honor that no storm could wash away. This acceptance created a resilience unmatched. To the Viking, every breath was a gift. Every day a chance to carve one's name into the saga of time. The end was certain, but meaning lay in how the journey was walked. And always, the shadow of Ragnarok loomed. The end of all things was not distant myth, but a truth that shaped every thought. One day, the wolf Fenrir would break his chains, Jormungandr the serpent would rise from the sea, and fire would consume the world. Even the gods would fall. Yet from this ruin, a new world would be born, green, fertile, and alive with hope. In this vision, the Norse found strength. If even the gods must face their doom with courage, how could men do less? Life was fleeting, but the cycle eternal. Death was not the end of the story. It was a chapter in a saga without end. So, when the fire in the longhouse dimmed and silence fell, Vikings looked into the embers and thought of what awaited beyond. Some dreamed of Valhalla's endless feasts, others of quiet meadows, still others of dark halls beneath the earth. But none doubted that something awaited, and in that certainty, they found peace. The Viking soul was not forged only in battle, but in the calm acceptance of fate. Beyond raids, beyond farming, beyond love and kinship, Their deepest strength lay in this truth: to live fully, to face death with honor, and to believe that the story continues beyond the grave. When we think of the Vikings, we often picture burning villages, roaring warriors, and sails on the horizon. Yet their true legacy is quieter, hidden in the echoes of language, law, farming, and community that still shape the world today. The sword was only one side of their story. The plow, the loom, and the hearth carried equal weight. Every farm tilled in rocky soil. Every longhouse warmed against the cold. Every bond of kinship and oath of honor. These were seeds that grew far beyond Scandinavia. What history remembers as raiders, Europe also remembers as settlers, traders, and neighbors. Across the British Isles, Norse settlers built towns and farms that endured for centuries. York, once a Forwick, became Jorvik, a thriving hub of trade where English and Norse words mingled until they wove into the fabric of modern English. Even today, hundreds of words in our language, sky, egg, window, husband, law, carry the echo of old Norse voices, spoken in longhouses lit by fire. This quiet legacy is not carved in stone, but whispered in every word, passed unknowingly from their time into ours. In law and governance, too, the Norse left their mark. The Thing, their great assembly, was a gathering of free men who met to settle disputes, pass judgment, and speak their voices. It was not ruled by kings alone, but by community, where even the poorest could raise a hand and be heard. This idea, that law belonged not only to rulers but to the people, traveled with the Norse wherever they settled. In Iceland, the Althing became one of the world's first parliaments, a tradition of open assembly that still endures today. Their legacy stretched into craft and commerce. The sleek design of their ships influenced naval architecture for centuries. Their sturdy farming methods spread across the lands they settled, and their trading networks connected distant worlds. Coins from Baghdad have been found in Swedish soil, glass beads from Italy in Norwegian graves. They did not only raid Europe, they stitched it together with threads of trade. Behind every silver coin in a hoard, every amber bead in a necklace, lies the story of Norse hands, quietly shaping the global web of exchange long before the age of empires. Even in myth and poetry, their voices still sing. The sagas of Iceland, written down long after Viking days had passed, preserve stories of gods and heroes, of love and loss. These tales, whispered first in smoke-filled halls, inspired poets and writers for centuries to come. Without them, the world would not know of Odin's wisdom, Thor's thunder, or Loki's tricks. And within those myths lies more than entertainment. They hold the values of endurance, honor, and courage that defined a people. Their stories became humanity's stories, passed across lands and ages. Architecture bore their influence as well. In rural churches across Scandinavia, the wooden stave structures of the medieval age echo the beams of longhouses. Their art, dragons curling in endless knots, beasts biting their own tails, patterns flowing like rivers, endures in carvings, jewelry, and manuscripts. These designs traveled, too, influencing the ornament of lands far beyond the fjords. What began as patterns carved into combs and brooches now ripple through centuries of design, subtle but eternal. Perhaps their greatest legacy was the spirit of resilience. To take harsh land and make it home, to sail unknown seas with nothing but wood and will, to survive winters when hunger pressed close. This was the Viking gift to history. Not destruction, but endurance. Not conquest, but community. Generations learned from their example that courage is not only in battle, but in facing storms, in raising children, in tilling fields that yield little but are tended still. Their strength was quiet, but it echoes loud through time. When the Viking Age ended, it did not end with fire, but with transformation. Norse families became part of the lands they once raided. They married, traded, settled, and blended with other peoples. The children of Vikings spoke new tongues, yet carried within them the memory of fjords, myths, and ancestors. The longships no longer crossed seas, but the ideas of those who built them sailed on, in law, in language, in culture. The Vikings vanished as a people, yet their spirit became part of the wider human story. Oh, when we think of the Vikings, let us remember not only the clang of swords, but the laughter of children by the hearth, the hands weaving cloth, the farmers scattering seed into stubborn earth, the poets reciting under firelight. Their quiet legacy lives in the words we speak, the laws we follow, the courage we admire, and the stories we tell. Beyond the raids, beyond the storms, the Norse left us something greater than fear. They left us memory. And in that memory, their spirit endures, timeless, human, eternal. In every longhouse, amid the smoke and chatter of adults, children played at the edges of firelight. Their laughter rang against timber walls. Their small feet pattered across packed earth floors. To be a child in the Viking world was to grow up quickly, yet also to dream deeply. From the moment of birth, life was both fragile and precious. Infants were sprinkled with water in a naming ritual, binding them to kin and gods alike. Names carried power, chosen to honor ancestors or invoke strength. In the name lived hope, memory, and destiny. Childhood was brief, for survival demanded contribution. By the age of 5 or 6, little hands fetched water, gathered firewood, and carried food to animals. Boys followed their fathers into the fields or the forests, learning to plow, fish, and handle axes. Girls sat beside their mothers at the loom, spinning wool into thread, or at the hearth, learning the secrets of herbs and healing. Yet even in labor, play remained. Wooden swords, carved animals, and simple games filled moments of light between duties. Toys were crafted for what the land provided. A child might hold a small wooden horse, its body carved smooth by a father's knife, or play with dolls stuffed with wool, stitched by a mother's hand. Bones became dice, stones became tokens for board games. These humble objects carried great meaning, for they taught skills of strategy, imagination, and storytelling. Play was never wasted. It was a mirror of the life they would grow into. Education did not come from books, but from memory and example. Elders recited sagas, and children listened with wide eyes as heroes and gods came alive in firelit halls. A boy repeated verses until he knew them by heart, for words were as sharp as blades in Norse culture. A girl learned the wisdom of herbs, the rhythm of weaving, the skill of managing a household. Each lesson was woven into daily life, until learning and living became one. Discipline was steady but fair. A child who shirked chores would be corrected, but harshness was not admired. What mattered most was honor, teaching children that their actions reflected upon kin, to share food, to greet guests with kindness, to listen with respect. These were lessons as important as wielding an axe. A child grew not only into strength, but into a bearer of reputation, carrying the weight of ancestors on their small shoulders. The seasons shaped childhood as much as age. In summer, children ran barefoot through fields, helping with planting and harvest, swimming in rivers, and chasing animals across meadows. In winter, they stayed close to the hearth, carving small trinkets from wood, listening to endless tales, or practicing songs that filled long nights with cheer. The rhythm of nature was their teacher, showing them patience, endurance, and awe. Games and competitions prepared them for adulthood. Boys wrestled in the grass, testing strength and stamina. Girls raced each other, sang riddles, and practiced the art of speech. Some games sharpened the mind, like Nefataful, the board game of kings and strategy, while others trained the body. Childhood was not sheltered. It was a training ground, shaping strong, resilient souls for the challenges of the North. But childhood was not free from danger. Sickness often swept through villages, and many children did not live to adulthood. Each loss was mourned deeply, yet life pressed forward, for survival left no room for endless grief. Those who survived grew stronger, carrying the memory of siblings and playmates who had not. To endure childhood in the Viking world was itself an act of courage. Despite hardship, joy bloomed in small things. A feast day meant sweets of honey, laughter shared in the firelight, and perhaps a gift, a bead, a new toy, a simple charm carved from bone. Festivals lit their eyes with wonder, watching skalds weave stories or hearing drums beat as dancers stamped the earth. To be a child was to live in awe, caught between the weight of duty and the sparkle of magic. And so the Viking child grew, shaped by family, strengthened by chores, guided by stories, and bound by kin. One day, the boy would take up an axe, the girl the keys of the household. Yet they carried with them the laughter of games, the comfort of stories, the touch of ancestors' hands upon their lives. In the end, every Viking warrior, farmer, and mother was once a child at the hearth, eyes wide, listening to sagas, dreaming of the world beyond the walls of home. Their childhoods were short, yet their echoes shaped the future of the North. In the long houses of the North, when the hearth glowed and ale flowed, there was always one voice that rose above the rest, the voice of the skald. These poets were not mere entertainers. They were the keepers of memory, the guardians of stories, the weavers of words that outlasted swords. With nothing but their voices, they carved history into the minds of their people. A skald stood with harp in hand, or sometimes only with the rhythm of his own voice. He sang not for himself, but for the hall, for the ancestors, for the gods. His songs carried weight, for words were sacred. To praise a man was to grant him immortality. To mock him was to cut him deeper than any blade. The skald's craft was one of complexity and beauty. Their verses were woven with kennings, poetic riddles that transformed simple words into shimmering imagery. The sea became the whale road, gold was Freya's tears, and a sword was the flame of battle. In this way, language itself became magic, turning the ordinary into the divine. Children learned these phrases by heart, repeating them until they too could see the world through the poet's eyes. To speak in kennings was to glimpse the hidden patterns of the cosmos, to honor the gods through artistry of the tongue. Skalds were also historians. In a world without books, memory was parchment and the mind was ink. They recited genealogies of kings, the deeds of heroes, the tragedies of battles, and the bargains of gods. At feasts, they gave voice to the past, reminding warriors that their names would only endure if sung. A chieftain valued a skald as much as a sword arm. For what use was victory if no one remembered it? To be praised in verse was to live forever, carried in the hearts of listeners long after the grave closed. But their songs were not only for the mighty. Skalds sang of love, of longing, of grief. A simple verse might capture the tenderness of a mother's hand, or the sorrow of a sailor lost to the sea. Their words gave shape to feelings that could not be spoken otherwise. In a land of harsh winters and endless labor, poetry became warmth for the soul. Even the gods themselves were bound by poetry. Odin, it was said, once stole the mead of inspiration, risking all to bring poetry to humankind. Every skald's verse was an echo of that divine theft, proof that words were as powerful as steel. The skald's place was not always safe. Their words could wound as much as they healed. A mocking verse could destroy a reputation, turn friends into enemies, or shame a man beyond recovery. Some chieftains feared their sharp tongues, knowing that to offend a poet was to risk being remembered in disgrace. Yet this danger gave the skalds their strength. They walked the line between art and judgment, truth and flattery. They were both celebrated and feared, respected for the power of their voices in a world where memory was eternity. Training to become a skald was long and demanding. A young apprentice might spend years memorizing sagas, learning the intricate meters of verse, practicing riddles and rhymes until they flowed as naturally as speech. To stumble in recitation was shameful. To recite flawlessly was glory. Their art demanded a mind sharper than a blade, and patience greater than any warrior's. In this way, the skalds carried the weight of knowledge. They were not only performers, but teachers, ensuring that the wisdom of ages was never lost. At great festivals, the skald's voice could rise above the roar of hundreds. His verses bound together past and present, linking ancestors to descendants, gods to mortals. A hall might fall silent at the sound of his words, as if even the gods leaned closer to listen. And when the last note faded, applause erupted like thunder, horns were raised, and silver was pressed into the poet's hand. But more precious than silver was the memory. Those who heard the song carried it with them, whispering it to children, repeating it at their own hearths. Thus, one voice became 1,000, and memory spread like fire across the north. Skald were travelers, too. They moved from hall to hall, from one chieftain's hearth to another, carrying news, stories, and verses across vast distances. In their journeys, they became bridges, linking far-flung families, spreading sagas from fjords to islands, carrying word of battles, alliances, and betrayals. In their memory, the North was united. To meet a skald was to meet living history, to see one who held the past and the future in his voice. Even after the Viking age faded, the skaldic tradition endured. In Iceland, scribes wrote down sagas that had been sung for centuries, preserving them for the world. Without the skalds, Odin, Thor, and Loki might have been forgotten, their stories swallowed by time. Instead, they live still, not in temples or sacrifices, but in the words that echo through books, poems, and songs. The skalds gave the Vikings immortality, not through conquest, but through memory. So when you imagine the North, do not only hear the clash of axes or the roar of storms. Listen also for the quieter sound, a voice rising above the hall, weaving kennings in a firelight, turning memory into song. The skalds were the soul of their people, and their words still echo, soft as breath, strong as steel, eternal as the sagas themselves. The land of the North was ruled not by kings, but by the turning of the seasons. Each one was a force, shaping the lives of every farmer, warrior, and child. To the Vikings, the year was not a circle of months, but a cycle of survival. Spring was hope, summer was labor, autumn was preparation, and winter was trial. Life itself rose and fell with these rhythms, and so their stories, their rituals, and their souls became bound to the seasons. Spring arrived hesitantly in Scandinavia. Snow melted slowly from the mountains, feeding rivers that roared with life. Farmers guided oxen into the damp soil, plowing furrows for barley, rye, and oats. The first green shoots were celebrated with offerings to Freyr, the god of fertility, for in those tiny stalks lay the promise of survival. Children gathered wild herbs. Mothers prepared fresh dairy after long months of scarcity, and the air filled with the sound of new lambs bleating in the fields. Spring was fragile, but it brought light after endless dark. Summer was the season of action. Long days stretched into golden evenings, the sun barely dipping below the horizon. Farmers harvested hay. Fishermen cast nets into seas teeming with life, and warriors took to their ships. Summer was when voyages began, whether for trade, exploration, or raid. Villages grew quieter as men sailed away, while women and elders carried the weight of tending farms. The fields glowed green, the fjords shimmered under the sun, and every breath carried the knowledge that these days of warmth must be seized before winter's return. Festivals marked the height of summer. Bonfires blazed on hilltops, horns of ale were raised, and families gathered to honor the gods for fertility and strength. It was a time of marriages, alliances, and oaths. Skalds sang under the open sky, their verses echoing across meadows. Children played in the tall grass, their laughter mixing with the hum of bees. Summer was joy, but beneath it lingered urgency. Every seed sown, every fish caught, every log split was a race against time, for the shadow of winter was never far. Autumn was the season of harvest and reckoning. Fields of barley bowed under sickles, barns filled with grain, and cellars brimmed with salted fish and dried meat. Families brewed ale and pressed honey into mead, preparing stores for the cold ahead. Herds were culled, for only the strongest animals could be kept alive through winter. Smoke curled from every village as meat was smoked and fish dried on wooden racks. The scent of preservation filled the air, a reminder that survival depended on foresight. But autumn was not only toil. It was also the time of the great harvest feasts. Families and neighbors gathered, tables heavy with food, to celebrate the bounty of the land. Offerings were made to the gods, thanking them for fertility and asking their blessing for the winter. Firelight flickered across faces flushed with joy, yet beneath the laughter lay worry. If the harvest was poor, hunger would soon arrive. Autumn was both abundance and anxiety, a bridge between life and death. Winter descended like a relentless king. The land turned silent, fields frozen under snow, rivers locked in ice. Days shrank to a few hours of pale light, nights stretched endless. Families huddled around the hearth, living off what they had stored. Hunger gnawed if preparations failed. Sickness spread in the cold, and storms howled outside. Yet winter was also the season of stories. With work slowed, people gathered to hear sagas of gods and heroes, to play games, to carve wood, and to sing. In hardship, community grew closest. Winter brought sacred festivals, the most important being Joel. For 12 nights, families lit fires, offered sacrifices, and feasted in defiance of the darkness. They honored ancestors, toasted the gods, and prayed for the sun's return. Pine boughs decorated halls, and children received small gifts. Joel was joy in the face of despair, a promise that light would come again. It carried hope like a torch through the longest night. The seasons were more than weather, they were teachers. Spring taught patience and hope. Summer demanded strength and courage. Autumn required wisdom and foresight. Winter tested endurance and faith. To live in the North was to learn these lessons again and again. A family that failed to respect the cycle soon perished. A family that honored it thrived. In this way, the seasons became part of their spirit, shaping not only survival but character. And so, year after year, the Vikings lived by the turning wheel of the seasons. When spring returned, they began again, planting, sailing, feasting, enduring. Their sagas, their rituals, their very souls were bound to this eternal rhythm. Beyond the clash of raids, beyond the myths of gods, their truest story was written by sun and snow, harvest and hunger, light and darkness. The northern seasons shaped them, and through them they shaped history. The sea was in the blood of the Vikings. To farm the land was survival, but to sail the waters was destiny. They looked out across the endless horizon and did not see fear. They saw promise. Their long ships, sleek and strong, carried them farther than any people of their time. They were wanderers driven by hunger, curiosity, and courage. And in their journeys, they discovered worlds no one else had dreamed of. The earliest wanderers struck westward, following the gulls and the whales. They reached the Faroe Islands, windswept and lonely, where sheep grazed and seabirds wheeled above the cliffs. From there, they pressed farther, their sails snapping in icy winds, until the green slopes of Iceland rose from the mist. There they built farms, raised families, and carved a home from lava fields and fjords. Iceland became not only a refuge, but a cradle of stories where sagas were born. But the Norse spirit did not rest. In the late 900s, Eric the Red, a man exiled from Iceland for bloodshed, steered his ship west and found a new land, Greenland. Though harsh and barren, its fjords offered pastures, and its waters teemed with seals and fish. Settlers followed him, building halls of turf and wood, clinging to life on the edge of ice. Greenland was both exile and opportunity, a reminder that for the Norse, even the most unforgiving land could be claimed. Beyond Greenland lay mystery. Sailors spoke of lands farther still, where forests grew thick and rivers ran rich with salmon. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, steered west and reached the shores of Vinland, believed by many to be North America. There, the Vikings found wild grapes, tall trees for timber, and fertile soil. For a brief time, they built shelters, lit fires, and walked a continent unknown to the rest of Europe. The Vinland settlement did not last. Encounters with indigenous peoples, whom the Norse called Skrælings, brought tension and conflict. Though the land was rich, the distance was great, and the settlers few. After only a handful of years, the Norse abandoned Vinland. Yet their footprints remained, proof that nearly 500 years before Columbus, Vikings had set foot in the New World. Not all wanderers went west. Others sailed east along rivers that cut through forests and steppes, linking the Baltic to the Black and Caspian seas. These river paths carried them deep into the lands of the Slavs and beyond. They became merchants, mercenaries, and rulers, founding settlements that would grow into cities like Novgorod and Kiev. Some entered the service of the Byzantine emperors, feared and admired as the Varangian Guard. The Norse became threads in the great tapestry of Europe and Asia. Wander was not only to seek land, but to seek wealth. The Norse traded amber, furs, and walrus ivory for silver, silk, and spices. They saw the mosaics of Constantinople, the deserts of the Abbasid Caliphate, the bustling markets of Baghdad. In their ships, they carried not only goods, but stories, returning to the fjords with tales of wonders far from the north. Their world was larger than we imagine, a world that stretched from the icy Arctic to the burning sands. But not every voyage was about conquest or trade. Some were pilgrimages, others were acts of faith. Christian converts among the Norse traveled to Rome and Jerusalem, blending old gods with new beliefs. Others sought knowledge, new lands for settlement, or simply the thrill of what lay beyond the horizon. Curiosity was as much a force as hunger, driving ships into unknown seas. The life of a wanderer was dangerous. Storms rose suddenly, waves towered like walls, and icebergs lurked in northern waters. A voyage could end in wealth or in watery graves. Yet each ship carried hope. Hope for land, for silver, for fame. Families waited in long houses, eyes fixed on the horizon, praying to see sails return. For every successful journey, there were others lost forever, their names remembered only in sorrowful songs. Yet the wanderers changed the world. They were not only raiders, they were settlers, explorers, and bridges between cultures. Their footsteps pressed into Icelandic soil, Greenland's ice, Vinland's forests, Slavic rivers, and Byzantine courts. They left behind words, bloodlines, and memories scattered across continents. Their journeys remind us that the Viking spirit was not bound to the north alone, but carried wherever their ships could reach. So, when we think of the Vikings, let us see not only the warrior's axe, but the wanderer's sail. Hear the creak of wood, the snap of canvas, the endless rush of waves. Imagine men and women standing at the edge of the world, staring west in a mist, daring to go where no one else had gone. Their legacy is not just in battles won or lost, but in the courage to wander, to seek, to dream. And in that courage, they carried the North into eternity. When the warriors marched to battle and the farmers tilled their fields, there were others who shaped the Viking world with quieter tools: knives, chisels, hammers, and brushes. In wood and stone, they left behind echoes that still whisper today. Unlike the clang of steel, these works were meant to endure. They carried meaning, memory, and magic, etched into every surface of daily life. Wood was the Vikings' canvas. Longships bore carved prows in the shapes of dragons, serpents, and beasts. These figures were not only decoration, but guardians, warding off sea spirits and striking fear into enemies. Inside the long house, beams and pillars were carved with flowing patterns, interlaced knots, curling animals, and abstract designs that seemed to twist like living vines. Even combs, spoons, and chests carried ornament, proving that beauty was woven into the fabric of life. Stone spoke, too. Across Scandinavia, runestones rose from the earth, tall slabs carved with inscriptions. Some marked graves, others proclaimed deeds, and many bore intricate spirals and beasts. The runes themselves carried power, their sharp lines holding messages of memory and honor. Here lies, this stone was raised in memory of simple words, yet carved to last 1,000 years. To raise a runestone was to defy time itself. Jewelry shimmered with meaning. Silver arm rings, bronze brooches, and necklaces strung with glass beads were more than adornment. They marked wealth, status, and loyalty. A ring given by a chieftain bound warriors to his service. A brooch held a woman's cloak, but also her dignity, often crafted with such beauty that it rivaled treasure from distant lands. Each piece carried stories of trade routes stretching across the world, of gifts exchanged in marriage, of faith in gods unseen. The art was alive with symbols. The serpent devouring its own tail, the Ouroboros, spoke of eternity. The Voknut, a knot of 3 triangles, whispered of death and Odin's power over fate. Thor's hammer appeared in amulets worn against the chest, offering protection and strength. These were not empty designs, but prayers made visible, charms that walked with their wearers into field, voyage, and battle. Ships themselves were masterpieces of art and engineering. The Oseberg ship, buried in Norway, carries carvings so intricate that even centuries later they seem to flow like waves. Its prow curls upward into the head of a serpent, its wood etched with knots that tangle and unwind. This was not only a vessel, it was a poem in wood, carrying its mistress into the afterlife. Carvings often told stories of the gods. One beam might show Thor battling the Midgard serpent, his hammer raised against the coils of chaos. Another might depict Odin hanging from Yggdrasil, sacrificing himself to gain the runes. These stories, cut into wood and stone, taught children as surely as Skald's verses. To walk through a Viking hall was to walk among myths, every surface alive with meaning. Art was not confined to nobles. Even humble tools bore designs. A farmer's axe with a small knot pattern, a fisherman's knife with runes carved into the hilt, a spindle whorl painted with spirals. The Norse believed that beauty and meaning belonged to all, not only the wealthy. To carve was to honor the gods, to leave one's mark upon the world, no matter how small. Color, too, played a role. Though time has stripped it away, many carvings and buildings were painted in bright reds, blues, and yellows. Shields glowed with color, ships bore striped sails, and wooden beams were sometimes coated in paint. The world of the Vikings was not gray and dim, but alive with vibrant hues, echoing the fire of their spirit. Through art, they also bridged worlds. Crosses appear beside hammers, Christian symbols blending with pagan ones as the North slowly shifted in faith. Runestones speak of Christ beside carvings of Odin. This fusion shows not conflict but adaptation, the Norse ability to weave old and new into one. Their art became a mirror of change, capturing a people in transition. What survived the centuries are fragments, ships buried in earth, brooches unearthed in graves, stones standing silent in fields. Yet even these remnants tell us of a culture that saw no divide between life and art. Every tool, every home, every ship carried beauty, faith, and identity carved into its very skin. Their echoes remain, whispering across time. So when you think of the Vikings, do not picture only axes and raids. Picture hands carving patiently into wood, chiseling patiently into stone, weaving meaning into silver and cloth. Their legacy lives not only in battles, but in patterns that swirl like rivers, in symbols that carry prayers, in art that speaks without words. These echoes in stone and wood are their true monuments, silent, enduring, eternal. Every age has its dawn and its dusk. For the Vikings, the dawn was fierce, sails on the horizon, swords flashing in the sun. But dusk came slowly, like winter creeping across the fjords. Their world did not end in one battle, nor in 1 year, but in generations of change, as the North softened and transformed. This was the last Viking winter, when the old ways faded into memory. By the 11th century, raids that once shook Europe began to falter. Kingdoms grew stronger. England, France, and others built armies and walls that blunted Norse attacks. No longer were monasteries easy prey. No longer were towns defenseless. The raiders became settlers, merchants, even farmers in foreign lands. The warrior's roar gave way to the plowman's quiet song. Christianity swept across the north, bringing new gods, new laws, and new ways of life. Wooden hammers of Thor were replaced by silver crosses. Pagan sacrifices at sacred groves gave way to stone churches rising from the earth. The old gods were not forgotten overnight, but slowly their temples grew silent. Skalds who once praised Odin now sang hymns to Christ. A new faith reshaped the Viking soul. Kings emerged where once there had been chieftains. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden began to form centralized rule, binding scattered clans into nations. With kings came taxes, laws, and order, forces that dulled the freedom of raiding and feasting. Warriors who once sailed for silver now swore oaths of loyalty to crowns. The age of small bands gave way to the age of kingdoms. The Norse colonies, too, felt the strain. Greenland struggled against ice and isolation, its farms shrinking as winters grew harsher. Vinland, once a spark of promise, was abandoned. Even Iceland, though rich in story, could not escape the weight of change. The wanderers had reached the edge of the world, but they could not hold it. The seas that had carried them so far became barriers once again. The last great Viking king was Harald Hardrada. In 1066, he sailed to England, seeking conquest and glory. At Stamford Bridge, his army met resistance, and there he fell. His death is often seen as the true end of the Viking Age, the final roar of a people whose sails had once filled the seas. Weeks later, another invasion came. William the Conqueror at Hastings, and Europe turned a new page. Yet even as raids ended, the spirit of the Norse endured. Their language blended into English. Their laws shaped nations. Their blood flowed in the veins of kings and peasants alike. The Viking Age ended, but the Viking people remained, not as marauders, but as neighbors, farmers, craftsmen, and storytellers. They did not vanish, they transformed. Winter in the north remained harsh, but the people no longer faced it with pagan rites alone. Bells rang from churches, prayers rose to Christ. Yet deep in the hearth's glow, whispers of Odin and Thor lingered still. The old gods lived quietly in memory, side by side with the new. In this blending, the Norse carried their past into their future, refusing to let it die. The sagas became their true legacy. Written down in Iceland long after the age of raids, they preserved what was fading from daily life. In their pages, warriors still battled, gods still schemed, lovers still wept. Though the Viking Age had ended, its spirit lived in words, echoes carved not in stone or wood, but in story. Archaeologists find their remnants still, ships buried in earth, weapons rusted in graves, runestones standing in fields. Each discovery whispers of lives once vibrant. A comb, a brooch, a child's toy carved from wood. These humble things remind us that the Vikings were not only warriors, but families, dreamers, and makers. Their last winter was not silence, but a transformation into memory. As centuries passed, the image of the Viking hardened into legend. To some, they remained demons of the sea. To others, noble explorers. Myths grew, and the truth became tangled with story. Yet beneath exaggeration lies a people who loved, farmed, sang, and built, who left behind not terror, but tradition. Their age ended, but their humanity endured. The last Viking winter was not only about endings, it was about rebirth. Out of the fading raids rose kingdoms, churches, and nations. Out of wandering came settlement. Out of myth came history. The Norse world did not die. It changed its form, carrying echoes of the past into the future. Their ships no longer cut through seas, but their influence still flowed like unseen currents beneath Europe's surface. So imagine that final winter. Snow falling on long houses, ships drawn up on shores, axes hanging quiet on walls. The gods were silent, the seas still, the raids no more. Yet within the halls, families gathered, stories told, fires burned. The Viking Age ended not with despair, but with warmth, with memory, with transformation, with legacy. And in that legacy, they live still, timeless as the northern stars. And so, The fires dim, and the long house falls silent. The sails are lowered, the fields rest beneath snow, and the voices of gods and skalds fade into memory. The Viking age has ended, but its spirit endures in the words we speak, in the laws we follow, in the courage we admire. We have walked with farmers, families, wanderers, poets, and dreamers. We have seen the joy of feasts, the weight of winter, the strength of kinship, and the quiet dignity of endings. Beyond the raids, beyond the storms, the Vikings have given us something greater than fear. They have given us memory. So sleep now, with the North still whispering in your dreams. The ships rest, the sagas are told, and the night is eternal.